Thank you very much, Sister Helen. I'm also grateful to Anna Marta and Cardinal Turkson for the invitation. This has really been wonderful. Just a couple of quick personal notes. Writing this paper helped me remember St. Thomas has, I think, been with me my whole life, and my debt to him is more than scholarly. My parents met when my father was doing research for a professor on Aquinas' thought, and in that context, he is from Kansas City. He visited nearby Topeka, Kansas Public Library, where a close friend of my mother's was the librarian. She introduced my parents. They were married a few months later. So thank you, St. Thomas, and here, right? And here we are. Also, just a thank you to Pope Francis. In that wonderful set of welcoming remarks, he highlighted foot washing. And early in his pontificate, watching the news one night, I saw him washing the feet of prisoners it was a Holy Thursday service, and he was in a prison. And I think it was a moment of grace for me. It just helped me realize, gee, I've never been in a prison. What should I do? And there's a prison program that Notre Dame and Holy Cross College had put together to help people earn their degrees in college. And just this last fall, I was finally able to teach in it, and I'm very grateful. It was a real gift for me. So the backdrop of my reflections today is an argument advanced in my first book, Aquinas, Aristotle, and the Promise of the Common Good, that Aquinas' increased emphasis on the common good, his enriching of Aristotelian natural right with a robust natural law theory, and his study in Christian theology enabled advances in understanding some key virtues contributing to personal and social and civic flourishing. Since Plato and Aristotle wrote, there's been a tendency to equate notions of justice and common good. The traditional subtitle for Plato's Republic, for example, is On the Just. In Book 3 of the Politics, Aristotle wrote that, quote, the political good is justice, and that this is, quote, the common advantage. Yet one may wonder whether justice suffices for fully human common goods to subsist. Is attention to the truth of justice and its implications enough? If not, what other important sources and aspects of the common good should be understood, stressed, and supported? Some of these are identified in Platonic and Aristotelian theory, including virtues like prudence, temperance, and courage. I'll focus today on 3 other virtues explored in the thought of St. Thomas, namely humility, charity, and mercy. So, and I'll be skipping large portions. That'll be a little choppy, but hopefully get some ideas out. So first, humility. One of the virtues supporting justice in the service of the common good, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, is magnanimity. Aristotle defines megalosoukia as the virtue concerned with the proper attitude towards the great honors that a person deserves, and as the disposition to benefit others on a grand scale. This socially significant virtue bespeaks self-confidence and self-sufficiency on the part of its possessor. If magnanimity constitutes a virtue, it appears that humility cannot. So Aquinas writes in the Summa, and this is one of the objections or initial arguments that he deals with, no virtue is opposed to another virtue, but humility is apparently opposed to the virtue of magnanimity, which aims at great things, whereas humility shuns them. In responding to this objection, Aquinas contends that humility and magnanimity are complementary virtues. Elsewhere, he describes them as duplex virtus, as single twofold excellence. Although they seem to tend in contrary directions, he writes, both of them incline moral agents to attitudes and actions in accord with right reason, the overarching function of human virtue. On Aquinas' account, humility moderates excessive or misplaced hope, curbing the, quote, impetuosity of that passion, and hence removing an obstacle to prudence. Magnanimity arouses and nourishes hope, motivating a person to attempt the good which he is capable of. Every human being, mortal, limited, and fallible, needs both of these traits. In addressing what Aquinas regards as the humble person's characteristic habit of esteeming virtually everybody, whereas by comparison, Aristotle's magnanimous man despises most people, looks down on them, even as he tries to benefit them. And the humble person's disposition of placing oneself at people's service whenever possible. Aquinas makes one of the more radical distinctions among his many famous distinctions. He writes, quote, "We may consider two things in man," that inclusive, homo, right, in man, namely that which is God's and that which is man's. End of quote. So the Aristotelian magnanimous man could not be too pleased to learn that what is properly speaking his, or anyone's for that matter, is, quote, defect and, quote, destruction, while, quote, whatever pertains to man's welfare and perfection is God's. If a person considers what is properly his in comparison with what his neighbor has from God, he cannot go wrong in esteeming his neighbor, whomever that person may be, as superior. Here's a quote, "We must not only revere God in himself, but also that which is his in each person, although not with the same measure of reverence as we revere God. Wherefore we should subject ourselves with humility to all of our neighbors for God's sake, according to 1 Peter, quote, be ye subject to every human creature for God's sake, but to God alone we owe the worship of latria or adoration." And so here we see pushing back against idolizing other human persons or polities. God is as Bishop Barron reminded us, on a transcendent scale. Aquinas' natural law teaching implies that different socio-political contexts tend to obscure some content of natural law and human virtue, even while illuminating other aspects. For instance, to give David Hume, a famous modern critic of humility, as, quote, a monkish virtue, and so really a vice in the world, at least, the benefit of the doubt, perhaps theological political problems of his era and the world-denying or hypocritical manner he sensed some Christians in the world living what they considered humility prevented him from seeing it as something other than a demeaning or debilitating passion. In more recent times, however, moral sensibilities like those shown by some dissonant scholars and social movement leaders lends experiential support, often from outside Thomistic circles and at times from non-Christians, for the humanity of humility and its role in forming the character of the truly magnanimous person who cares for the common good. Two examples I'll suggest are Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Václav Havel, with apologies for the pronunciation. In his 1957 sermon, Loving Your Enemies, Dr. King called attention to the plight of Black Americans who, quote, have been frustrated by day and bewildered by night by unbearable injustice and burdened with the ugly weight of discrimination. King adds, quote, "We are tempted to become bitter and to retaliate with a corresponding hate. But if this happens, the new order we seek will be little more than a duplicate of the old order. We must, in strength and humility, meet hate with love." Likewise, in his 1955 sermon, Pride versus Humility, Dr. King called his congregants' attention to the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, the one showing self-satisfied pride and contempt for neighbor, the other evincing humble awareness of sinfulness, sparking prayer for mercy and forgiveness. King cautions followers of Christ against mistaking, quote, ceremonial piety for genuine religious living. The latter rejecting prejudice and oppression, recognizing one's neighbor in each person, and taking pity on one another's weaknesses. The publican shows us how, King thinks, how sin separates us from our neighbors and God, and how humility prepares us for forgiveness and reconciliation, contrasted with the Pharisees quote, virtue, which was so cankered with pride that it was almost rotten, end of quote. So turning now to Czech dissident leader Václav Havel, who wrote in a 1984 essay, Politics and Conscience, against hubris and for humility from a phenomenological perspective, Havel urged jaded modern men and women to recover an awareness of their, quote, life world or natural world, together with a sense of ethical responsibility. This task entails recovering the simplicity, humility, and capacity for wonder manifested by small children. And here's the longer quote. They, children, are still rooted in a world which knows the dividing line between all that is intimately familiar and appropriately a subject of our concern, and that which lies beyond its horizon, that before which we should bow down humbly because of the mystery about it. The natural world is the realm of our inalienable and non-transferable joy and pain, a world in which, through which, and for which we are somehow answerable, a world of personal responsibility. At the basis of this world are values which are simply there, perennially, before we ever speak of them, before we reflect on them and inquire about them. The natural world, in virtue of its very being, bears within it the presupposition of the absolute, which grounds, delimits, animates, and directs it, without which it would be unthinkable, absurd, superfluous, and which we can only quietly respect. Any attempt to spurn it appears within the framework of the natural world as an expression of hubris, for which humans must pay a heavy price, as did Don Juan and Faust. So, okay, I'll skip a bit here for time purposes and move on to charity, the second of these virtues. As a Christian, Aquinas holds what the text of Genesis teaches, that all human beings, male and female, are made in God's image and likeness. And at the heart of the Christian understanding of God is God's great love. Deus caritas est, God is love, and God's desire to befriend all human beings and to bring them into his family as his children. That we can be friends with God. For Aristotle, impossible, right? But through Christ we know we can be friends with God, that God condescends in and through Christ and the Holy Spirit to offer us this gift of friendship was most clearly revealed by Christ at the Last Supper. I will not now call you servants, but my friends. In endeavoring to understand such friendship, Aquinas refers to Aristotle's discussion of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethic. Aquinas follows Aristotle in highlighting that love can only constitute friendship when it seeks the good of the friend for his own sake, and so wishes good for him. Friendship requires benevolence, here understood as a mutual and active well-wishing, founded, this is a quote, founded on some kind of communication. Accordingly, since there is a communication between man and God, inasmuch as God communicates his happiness to us, some kind of friendship must be based on this same communication, of which it is written, God is faithful, by whom you are called unto fellowship with his Son. The love which is based on this communication is charity. Wherefore it is evident that charity, writes Aquinas, is the friendship of man for God. In uniting a person to God, charity simultaneously unites him or her to all human beings. In loving God, a person loves all whom he loves, and that is everyone without exception. Aquinas explains this universal scope of charity by comparing it with honor. He writes, quote, love is not differentiated specifically on account of the various degrees of goodness in various persons, so long as it is referred to one good common to all, whereas honor is distinguished according to the good belonging to individuals. Consequently, we love all our neighbors with the same love of charity, insofar as they are referred to one good common to them all, which is God. Aquinas argues that charity is the highest virtue among humans, and that it is the form of all the other virtues, bringing them to their perfection and eliciting their fullest meaning by referring them to our final good. Charity and benevolence naturally issue forth in actions of beneficence, well-doing, to everyone we are able to benefit. Aquinas concedes that although, quote, as the love of charity extends to all, beneficence also should extend to all. Absolutely speaking, it is impossible for a human being to do good to every single person. Yet it is true of each person that one may be bound to do good to him in some particular case. Hence, charity binds a person, even though not in the act of doing good to somebody, to be prepared in mind to do good to anyone if time were available. End of quote. A final note of import for social ontology and common good is the connection Aquinas finds between charity and peace, both within a person and in society. Peace, as Aquinas argues, is a direct effect of charity. Aquinas describes the human or social common good as attained through, sustained by, and in part comprising what he calls the order in various places, the order of peace, justice, love, and virtue. Concurring with Augustine, Aquinas accords peace a central role in his social and political theory. If there is no peace within persons and among them in their relations, there can never be a full common good or a flourishing order of justice and virtue. And without charity, there is no peace, as now Aquinas boldly argues that charity is even more central to peace than is justice. I think striking. We've heard that if you want peace, work for justice, and this rings so true. But Aquinas wants to say, well, but something more is needed. Justice causes peace, he writes, quote, indirectly, by removing obstacles to its achievement and fulfillment. Charity surpasses justice because, quote, according to its very nature, it causes peace and does so directly, forging true and virtuous forms of union within and among human beings and between them and God. And in this case, looking for exemplars, perhaps a surprising exemplar, perhaps not, depending on the perspective we look at it from is, but thinking in politics, perhaps surprising, is St. Teresa of Calcutta. Who could have imagined in the 1940s, when she first picked up a destitute dying man and cared for him with love, that this soft-spoken founder of the Missionaries of Charity would receive the Nobel Peace Prize, which she accepted only in the name of the world's poor. Upon her death, Mother Teresa received a state funeral from the Indian government, an honor previously accorded only to presidents and prime ministers, with the sole exception of Gandhi. It seems that Mother Teresa's great charity, perhaps in spite of or perhaps because of its not being specifically political in its inspiration, scope, or aim, that made her a great citizen of her adopted country and a great citizen of the world. So now on to mercy, our third virtue. We're doing okay. All right. Okay. So I would like to have begun with and it's in the paper, and it's also shortened in the paper from what I would have liked it to be, but with the consideration of God's mercy. I'll be very brief because we need to, I need to cut some more, so I will cut here. But I'll just say sadly, because for me, the question on the justice and mercy of God and the two articles, it's interesting. Aquinas puts justice and mercy in the same article, God's justice and mercy, and especially the two articles on mercy in the Summa of mercy of God. Aquinas develops one of his most moving and powerful arguments, in my view. His case for the priority and greater power, to speak in human terms, of mercy compared with justice in God's actions towards creatures. And here Aquinas will establish mercy as a fitting attribute of God. So we will need to pass over those passages and move on to mercy as a human virtue. After the ravages of individualism and collectivism the 20th century civilization has suffered and that are continuing into the 21st century, sadly, It is perhaps not surprising that mercy in many venues is not a highly valued quality. Mercy, after all, connotes weakness, pity for the weakness of others. How then can mercy be truly an outstanding moral excellence that powerfully contributes to the common good? For Aquinas, while God's pity, his mercy, God being pure spirit, is through love alone, without any passion that requires corporality, or mercy corresponds to the passion of compassion. Mercy as a moral virtue for humans is an effect of the misery, the unhappiness, the hurt of one or more human beings. And it's concerned with one of our fellows. And it's taking the perspective of the human being who also likewise suffers or is apt to suffer deficiency or limitation. Mercy is a virtue for us because we are beings who long to be happy and yet are fallible, finite, changeable, mortal. In short, beings who suffer and can recognize, empathize with, and respond with aid to the suffering of others. Aquinas views a lack of mercy and the failure to recognize it as a virtue, because it is a matter of grief for others' sorrow, even though it be regulated by reason and work with the rule of truth and justice, as an indicator of excessive anger or pride, among other vices. Here's a quote: "Anger has no mercy, nor fury when it breaks forth." Aquinas is quoting Proverbs there. He goes on, "For the same reason the proud are without pity, because they despise others and think them wicked, so that they account them as suffering deservingly what they suffer." Following Gregory the Great, Aquinas argues that this is, quote, "the false godliness of the proud, not compassionate, but disdainful," end of quote. Contrasted with this is the true godliness of charity and mercy. And I'll just say a little shout out to Augustine. Aquinas is drawing from Augustine, among other sources, for his definition of mercy as a virtue, compassion as a good thing, if regulated by reason, according to reason, and also in his thought about peace. So just a little shout out to some positives in old Augustine. So charity in human beings, Aquinas writes, likens us to God by uniting us to him in the bond of love. Mercy likens us to God as regards similarity of work, end of quote. No matter how high human beings may be placed in positions of authority, so as to be in a position to benefit others who suffer, they can only live virtuous mercy by remembering that they too are subject to ill fortune, pain, and disgrace. Thus Aquinas distinguishes those who are truly wise. He writes, it's very moving, who like the truly wise are like the elderly, the weak, the fearful, who are aware, quote, that they may fall on evil times and are thus more inclined to pity. And in search of an exemplar for love and mercy in public life, can mercy inspire men and women inclined to take what Pope Benedict has called, quote, the institutional path? He writes, we might also call it the political path of charity, end of quote. Working through government, business, cultural institutions, and practices to advance justice, having the concerns of mercy and charity close at heart. One example indicating the possibility of such a, quote, institutional way of contributing to culture and political life in very imperfect circumstances, powerfully advancing justice and peace, though, is British parliamentarian, I would suggest, William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a lifelong member of the Church of England, influenced by Wesleyan Methodism. He was adamant that Christianity, if it were to mean anything, must be not only theoretical, but also practical. It must influence everything a Christian says and does, every action, every work, every ideal, even in the difficult sphere of politics. Wilberforce thus lamented the Enlightenment tendency or agenda to circumscribe the range of charity and compassion and all the virtues of the Christian within a mere fraction of private life. This was to suck the vitality out of religion, he thought, and also out of charity, and put them on a path to indifference, perhaps extinction. Wilberforce wrote, quote, "Though the heart be its special residence, true religion may be said to possess a degree of the ubiquity of its divine author. Every endeavor and pursuit must acknowledge its presence, and whatever does not or will not or cannot receive its sacred stamp is to be condemned as inherently defective, to be abstained from or abandoned." End of quote. Human virtues such as benevolence receive tremendous impetus and support from charity. Who could reasonably deny it, he suggests, after having witnessed its effects in the lives of others? Wilberforce himself experienced and exemplified these principles through his long struggle against the slave trade and slavery in the British Empire. A sincere but inconstant and timid proponent of abolition some years before his conversion, after an experience of grace and the love it infused, he felt a force that sustained him in promoting this great cause both in and out of season in Parliament. He soon realized that consciences must be touched and morals altered among the public for these measures to carry through in the legislature. He appealed to and encouraged compassion through disseminating information and also by bringing people sensibly in touch with the slave trade through smell, sight, hearing, many ways to try to spark a sense of reality and compassion, and thus to lead to justice and charity. He persevered through ill health, ridicule, and death threats. In the end, he saw the slave trade outlawed, and on his deathbed, he knew that the abolition bill was on its way to passage. There were those who complained that this was a dangerous meddling of religion and public life, but as with King's civil rights movement in America, in hindsight, perhaps few would complain about the salutary results. In his public arguments, moreover, Wilberforce appealed both to reason and to faith, to humanistic and moral principles and to religion. His practical Christianity was not a form of fideism adverse to trying to give, quote, a reason for the hope that is in it. And let me check time here. Okay, I think I'm all right. So just a couple more paragraphs. Wilberforce's vision and legacy indicate that a deeply human common good includes and requires mercy and love, allies and aids of peace and justice. These virtues motivate concern for the just and generous treatment of others and inspire sacrifice on behalf of others, the near and also the far whenever possible. And this, as we've been contemplating, is much more possible today in our global village. Local, national, and international authorities and political institutions should also look gratefully, I think, on religious communities, families, schools, and various civil associations where mercy and love charity are valued, exemplified, and encouraged closely and personally, and where future leaders are formed and inspired. Some words from Pope Benedict XVI's first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, God is Love, may conclude our reflections on Aquinas' ontology of virtue, social life, and common good, at least from this paper, leading into, I know, future ones to come. So here's a quote from Benedict. "Love, caritas, will always prove necessary, even in the most just society. There is no ordering of the state so just that it can eliminate the need for a service of love. Whoever wants to eliminate love is preparing to eliminate man as such. There will always be suffering which cries out for consolation and help. There will always be loneliness. There will always be situations of material need where help in the form of concrete love of neighbor is indispensable. The state, which would provide everything, absorbing everything into itself, would ultimately become a mere bureaucracy, incapable of guaranteeing the very thing which the suffering person, every person, needs, namely loving personal concern." Thank you.